Hi, everybody, and welcome back to A Foggy Day on Olympus, where we are exploring topics of history, religion, and culture from the grandiose perspective of Mount Olympus, as the Greek gods may have done many years ago. But of course, it is yet another foggy day. My name is Kawal Campo.
And I'm Mike Pierce, and this is the second episode in our series, If I'm Catholic or Atheist or Jewish or Muslim, what did the Reformation do for us? So last time we looked at changes in respect of culture, and today we're looking at, well, we've called it geopolitics and religion. Really, it's the connection between politics and religion. That's the point, and that's what we're really looking at today.
Yeah, so we're saying that the consequences of the Reformation affect our ideas about the relationship between religion and politics today.
Yes, very much. This was really a kind of long-term unintended consequence. One thing that I found when I was teaching in college was that most students had grown up on the idea that the Reformation was all about bringing in religious freedom, religious liberty, and that was very, very far from the case. But several generations up the road, that or something grumpily and grudgingly like that did happen. Though today I think we're going to be looking even more at the changing relationship between religion and the state. So maybe it's a good place to start off by looking at the different outlooks on this subject, the church-state relationship, between perhaps the five most important categories. Now, when I say the five most important, the first two are way more important than the others because, of course, they had been there in the long term for the 1,000 years of the Middle Ages. And I really want to underscore the big differences between those two before the other ones make very much sense. So, in the Orthodox world, church and state are considered partners, but the ruler, think of the Byzantine Empire, is God's appointee, so that the church is subject to the secular authorities. And that, now we see this even today to an extent with the idea of autocephaly, that to recognize autocephaly is the idea that an Orthodox church within a particular country is self-governing. And for such a church to have the status of autocephaly, that is being recognized by all the other Orthodox churches, is by strong implication to recognize the legitimacy of the existence of the state in which it lives. To withhold that, by equally strong implication, is to cast doubts on the legitimacy of the state in which it lives. Now, the most recent example of this whole conundrum is the situation of North Macedonia, where the population is majority Orthodox. There's a large Muslim population as well. But the other Orthodox churches didn't recognize its autocephaly for quite a long while until just very, very few years ago. And that put pressure on the state itself. Now, in the long run history of the Orthodox Church, it's been seen as a religious duty, not simply to uphold the authorities, whatever they may be, even under communism, but actually to be supportive of them and completely subject to them. Now, that's a big difference with the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, where the state is, at least in theory, to an extent in practice, subject to the church, and the king to the Pope. And the reason for that dates back to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire collapses under barbarian invasions in the 5th and 6th centuries. And so the machinery of Roman government is largely dismantled. All these barbarian chiefs come in, they're not literate. And the church, with its structure of parishes going up to bishops, going up to archbishops, with its summit in the Pope, that remains intact. And that's pretty much the only major institution remaining from the previous situation. And the new rulers needed them. I mean, we have a linguistic fossil of this in English. Clerk, or an American clerk, comes from clericus, a clergyman, the only guy around who could read and write, and therefore keep records of who paid taxes and who hadn't, and of assessing them, of sending communications to other rulers, of having written records of laws and things like this. So, the long legacy of that during the 1,000 years of the Middle Ages is that kings were, in many ways, subject to the Pope. And if you were a king of France in the 14th century, the church had far more say over the daily lives of your subjects than you did, far more intimately, from holidays to keeping order in parishes, particularly moral order, sanctioning marriages, and so on. And even with more political things, how did people get to know that there was a new law or that the king had died and a new king was installed? It would be read out in the parish church, right? If there were illegal transactions taking place, cattle or sheep being sold, well, this happened by the priest presiding in the parish, the porch of the parish church, with both sides taking oaths, and so on. Embarrassingly, something exactly similar was the case with marriages, and we've got echoes of that even in wedding ceremonies today. Right. So the other thing was, if I'm the King of France in the 14th century, don't quarrel with the Pope, because he might release my leading vassals, my big nobles, from their vows of allegiance to me, and they might overthrow me or kill me. And they would have Holy Mother Church on their side. Don't quarrel with the Pope.
So, is it fair to say that the majority of people felt like their allegiance was more to the Roman Catholic Church than even their kings or their rulers?
To some significant extent, because we need to remember, and we referred to this briefly in a later episode of our previous series about why the rest hates the West. We'll look at it more in some future series. There isn't really in any significant national consciousness. So if the kingdom is invaded by somebody else, they wouldn't experience that as we might today if our country were invaded by an outsider, as some sort of collective rape. Right? It will simply have been the replacement of one ruler by another one, and as long as they left us more or less alone, didn't tax us too heavily, didn't interfere with our customs too much, then we would just accept that. So yeah, people identified more with that meta entity than with the other big entity, which was the kingdom. Right? I don't want to exaggerate that, but broadly, that is true. Now,
Sure.
the churches of the Reformation altered this and generated a situation in which, in the West too, the church becomes subject to the state. Luther had said that it was the duty of the prince or the ruler to reform the church within his realms, since it will not reform itself. And the church is to be subject to secular government. So, yeah, that kind of reproduced the Eastern situation, only in the West. The Calvinist or Reformed view was that secular and church authorities are to work separately in their different spheres, but this is not separation of church and state in the way we might understand it today, particularly in America. Not at all. Secular rulers, in this theory, are to uphold the church and obey it and punish dissent from it.
Yeah, how does that even work, though? If the secular rulers are the ones who decide that their state's church will be reformed, then why on earth would they then agree to obey it?
Right. This was a very real practical problem, and we don't have to look any further than Calvin's Geneva to see it, right? With this a constant struggle going on during his career as to who's really in charge and makes the final call on these things, right? So, but this remained an aspiration of pious Reformed churchmen in other countries that went Reformed, and of course they never really got their way. In practice, once you become Protestant, then the state is going to tell the church what to do. or at a minimum, feel free to ignore the church leaders when they get fed up with them. Now, we need to mention the Anabaptist view. They don't particularly have a view on church-state relationship, or they do, but only in a completely negative sense. Now, when we say Anabaptist here, we're ignoring the crazy guys, the wild and the violent guys, and the heretics. We are talking here about the biblicist evangelical Anabaptists, who are the ones who survived for the long term and have come down to us today. And in their view, Christians are to have nothing to do with worldly power. There neither is, in this view, nor can be such a thing as a Christian state. Now, that implies religious toleration, right? But in fact, Anabaptist leaders merely pointed out the hypocrisy of persecuting true believers themselves in the name of Christianity. So they were taking their hands so far away from the levers of state power, they weren't even saying there should be a religious toleration. They were just saying, we're going to do our thing, and if you persecute us, well, we think you're hypocrites, but we can't stop you. We're going to do this anyway. That's it. But of course, the logic, if people are persuaded by this way of doing things, is that in fact there will be religious toleration. Now, I mischievously, because I'm always wanting to cause trouble, like to point out that all Christians are effectively Anabaptists now. Because nobody's got to be part of any of these churches. There is, in fact, religious toleration, right? So even if you're a Catholic, never mind Lutheran or Reformed, you are in fact operating as Anabaptists because it's a voluntary body.
Anabaptism, when does that come about? When does that start? Is that like, does that come out of the Reformation as well?
Yes, yeah. It begins in January 1525. Those are the first recorded believers' baptisms of modern times. And it spreads like wildfire, though loads of it is taken up by crazy people. But it's the biblicist guys that win out in the long run, precisely because the crazy stuff is simply not sustainable.
Right.
So, yeah, that would be it. I mean, the main groups that have come down to us in the present would be the Mennonites, although they themselves have fractured into different factions in more recent centuries, named after their most famous leader, Menno Simons. Okay, well, I think in the last episode I mentioned the fact that England had a complete dog's breakfast, as we say, of a Reformation. But precisely for that reason, it illustrates, perhaps best of all, the fact that if there's going to be a Reformation, the secular rulers are now in charge in a way that they just hadn't been during the Catholic Middle Ages. So let's start with this man, the monster, Henry VIII, whom everybody remembers married, most people, and at least got around to visiting a lot of the others. He doesn't see himself as a Protestant at all. He would have been mortally offended, and you don't want to offend Henry VIII, if you'd called him a Protestant. But he breaks away from the Roman Catholic Church because he wants to have his marriage to Catherine of Aragon declared null and void, for reasons we can't enter into here, and marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope won't allow it, so he's quite sure that his own senior clergyman within England would not dare to refuse him. And so there's a break between England and the Roman Catholic Church. But for the remainder of his lifetime, though religious policy fluctuates quite a bit, what it is mostly is Catholicism without the Pope. Or perhaps Catholicism with Henry as his own Pope. Yeah. Now, he's succeeded by his son in 1547, this young lad, Edward VI, who is only 9 years old. Well, you can be 9 days old and reign, but you can't rule until you're an adult or something tolerably approaching it. Right? So the country's actually run by his various uncles and minders, who were pretty horrible people and fought one another like ferrets in a sack. But one thing they were agreed on was following a proper Protestantization policy. One of the things that had happened in the later years of Henry VIII was that certain quasi-Protestantizing measures had been taken, like the monasteries had been abolished, along with their lands taken into royal possession. A financial win for the king. but the church services were still the Mass held in Latin. Under the various uncles and minders of Edward VI, that was all changed, and doctrine was brought into line with Protestantism. The English Book of Common Prayer was introduced, so that from 1549 onwards, services were held in English. And this was huge change, the most visible one by far, as far as ordinary people were concerned. Up until then, everything that had happened had all been kind of high politics going on way above their heads and changed little or nothing, unless you happened to be a tenant of the monasteries. Right? But in 1549, you couldn't ignore it. Right?
And did these guys have a specific reason for wanting to push now Protestantism instead?
Well, their reasons will, I mean, in some cases, they will have been genuinely religious convictions, but a lot of it will have been the same as rulers in other states, in Germany, for example, that turned Protestant, that this is a big advantage for secular rulers because we can take control of the church and its finances and everything else within our frontiers. So
Right.
there's that advantage as well. But a number of them will have come under the influence of Protestant-inspired education, as indeed had Edward VI. In his declining years, Henry had allowed his sixth and last wife, Catherine Parr, who was not very secretly Protestant, to choose the tutors for the son and heir. So Henry seems late on in his life to have thought, well, okay, maybe England will go Protestant, just not during my lifetime. And indeed, in this picture here, this painting, the authority of Henry is being invoked. So we have the old King Henry on his deathbed pointing to his son, this is my son, blah, blah, blah. And here you have the wise governors, and they're pushing, at the bottom of the picture, you can see they're pushing the Pope and the monks out of England. And indeed, the Pope's head is being pushed downwards by a book, the Bible. And if you zoom in, you can see that the text in the Bible is open at Isaiah, where it says, all flesh is grass, the word of the Lord endureth. Right? So the idea being that Catholicism is simply man-made, human religion, but Bible religion is what lasts and needs to drive this out of the country. So it's a piece of propaganda.
And why is it invoking Henry VIII's authority after he's dead?
Well, because repulsive, horrible man though he was a successful king. And pre-modern people were much more likely to admire rulers who, however brutal they were actually strong and kept order than perhaps we are. Or I don't know, maybe we're changing looking around at the current political scene. So he will have had that kind of kudos. And of course, Edward was just a boy, so there needed to be a way of invoking something bigger and more powerful than him, even though Henry was now dead. So the idea is that the uncles and minders are simply carrying out the policy that Henry would have wished, which is arguable but doubtful. Okay, so Edward dies at the age of 15, not married, no children, and his half sister, Mary Tudor, comes to the throne. Now, I think she is a much maligned character. I mean, nobody could say she was particularly nice, but people show too little understanding for her. Born 1516, so until she's 14, just when the hormones are starting to really pump through and you're at the most volatile age, you suddenly are no longer the heir to the throne. In fact, you're not even legitimate, apparently, because with the break from the Rome, the marriage to Catherine of Aragon is declared null and void. So she's no longer the heir to the throne. She's kept away from the court like a bad smell. And her father goes and marries any number of other women in succession, of course, which she will be disdainful about. She's not allowed to marry because the trouble with getting married is you tend to have children. and they didn't want rival claimants to the throne 20 years up the road. And now Edward is dead, and she is going to right all the wrongs, as she sees it, of the past 20 years. So she wants to make England Catholic again, and that's entirely understandable. And to reinstate the connection with Spain. Her mother, remember, Catherine of Aragon, she marries Philip II, King of Spain, who was perhaps conveniently fresh out of wives, his wife just having died. He was extremely unpopular in England. They failed to have any children, and she died at the age of 42, shortly afterwards, knowing that she, in the long run, failed to re-Catholicize England because the next claimant to the throne was our half-sister Elizabeth, who was the daughter of Anne Boleyn. So just as Mary in her own body represented England's Catholic past, so Elizabeth, in her own body, represented the break from Rome. And Elizabeth was a sort of minimalist Protestant, certainly more emphatically Protestant than her father, but whom she admired, but basically established the Church of England again as separate from Rome, which in its theology was moderately, but nevertheless definitely reformed, but in its ceremonies, although in English, looked quasi-Catholic. And it's left the Church of England as a sort of disputable halfway house ever since, which it still is. So let's get this straight now. Under Henry, the Church had been Catholic with a small c. Under Edward VI, it had been Protestant. Under Mary, it had been Roman Catholic. And under Elizabeth, it goes back to being Protestant. There could be no clearer illustration of the subjection of the Church to the state as a consequence of the Reformation. Even when it's Catholic because Mary decides it will be.
And how much does all of this back and forth really affect like the average peasant or the people? Are they really having to change their religious rituals and their beliefs every time that they go back and forth, or it's still like, well, this is politics and stuff going on that's really way above our heads and we don't really care?
Right. Well, the majority will have reflected the last bit of what you said. There were absolutely convinced Protestants, and under Mary, some of them fled into exile on the continent, others met in secret, and some of them were, about 300, were burned alive for their faith. And once Elizabeth became queen, there were indeed a number of convinced Catholics who tried to continue to practice secretly. But the majority took this kind of slightly bewildered, slightly jaded view that you reflected. One incident that was unintentionally hilarious occurred in, I think it's about 1563, when some church inspectors, who were 5 years into Elizabeth's reign, visit some parishes and find that buried in a shallow grave are a whole load of paraphernalia connected with Catholic ritual. And senior Protestant churchmen are horrified. They're certain that these villagers are at least hoping and perhaps plotting that Elizabeth will die and be replaced by her nearest relative, another Mary, the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots. Right? But in fact, they were doing no such thing. There have been all of these changes. This was simple financial prudence. Every 5 years, these people, and they're just peasants, remember, living close to the margins of existence, having to throw out one load of precious stuff and get in another. And this happened over and over. And they're just thinking, well, we wish Her Majesty well, but who knows what's going to happen? She's no further away than a severe cold or an assassin's dagger from dying. And then where will we be? We'll have to fork out all over again. So, yes,
Right,
they are taking this kind of wait and see sort of view. Absolutely. Well, another illustration of the same sort of trend, going rather further down the trajectory towards modern times, is illustrated by the Dutch Revolt. Now, this is a very complicated story, and I'm going to simplify it grotesquely. Our Dutch viewers are going to be outraged, but here goes. The Low Countries, comprising, broadly speaking, the territories that today we call the Netherlands and Belgium, had been part of the Holy Roman Empire. Because of various dynastic exigencies, which we can't go into now, they found themselves from the 1550s under the rule of Philip II of Spain. The Reformation had made not very great inroads into these territories during the first 40 years of the Reformation. But from the 1550s, the Reformed made serious inroads into the southern part, which was then the economically and commercially most developed, which is where the Reformed tended to pick up, particularly in Antwerp, which is today a major port in Belgium, then was the major port in Northern Europe. Philip and his regent in the territory, because obviously Philip spent most of his time in Spain, so his regent in the territory, his kinswoman Margaret of Parma, was charged with persecuting this heresy. Now, two things need to be mentioned here. One, because the past is mostly so different to the present everywhere, we always make the mistake of thinking that it must be like the present. But in one respect, it's true. The Netherlands had always been a relatively liberal, easygoing sort of a place. And the majority of the population who were Catholic were not very happy. They didn't like these reformed people, but they liked even less the fact that they were being persecuted and burned. But also, there'd been a very considerable degree of self-government in the various provinces of the Low Countries. And what Philip and Margaret of Parma was doing was centralising power. Particularly, central government was behind persecuting the Reformed, and when it arrested and or killed them, it confiscated their property. It didn't go to the locality, it went to central government. So all of this together, along with general dissatisfaction with the rising power of central government, led to a revolt. Now, this revolt lasted in one form or another for, let us say, 80 years. I know that sounds bonkers, but it's true. Fairly early on, one of the major incidents in this revolt was what we call the Spanish Fury, the sack of Antwerp in 1576 by Spanish soldiers, in which they massacred a goodly part of the citizens. And lots of people fled north. So many, in fact, that it was the northern regions that then became, as a result of this, the stronghold of the Protestants. And they set up a newish city, Amsterdam, which flourished. So the north becomes the centre of the revolt. The fighting went on until 1609, when both sides were exhausted, and they agreed to have a 12-year truce. And in 1621, both sides were as good as their word and started knocking eight bells out of one another again for another 27 years until 1648, to no enormous territorial advantage. The result was the division of those territories into what in the long run has become the Netherlands, today Protestant dominated, and the southern part, the Spanish Netherlands, later on the Austrian Netherlands, today, since 1830 anyway, Belgium, which is overwhelmingly Catholic because the Spanish kept their hold on it. Now, watch what happens here. The Dutch, by this we're referring really just to the northern part, what we now call the Dutch in the Netherlands, accidentally blundered during this long rebellion into religious toleration, even though no one really wanted it. The revolt could not succeed without the support of moderate Dutch Catholics. And remember, Catholics were still the majority. Right? The moderates tended to support the rebels. They didn't like Calvinists, but they didn't like them being persecuted. They didn't like centralization of government, etc., etc. So if you are the Calvinist leaders of the revolt, you actually have to tolerate Catholics. The trouble with that is you think that Catholics belong to the Church of Antichrist. So between splintering teeth, they had to find a way of tolerating them in practice. Well, if you're going to tolerate the Church of Antichrist, tolerating others will come quite easily to you after that. The rebel cause depended on commercial economic strength, and Amsterdam was booming. Right? Spain was a very intolerant place, and so Moriscos and Marranos, people descended from Muslim Moors and from Jews in Spain, fled there. At first, just going to trade, and then deciding, it's nicer here than back home in Spain. At least they're not constantly harassing us or trying to imprison us. And so Amsterdam became a multi-confessional sort of city. Anabaptists had taken root there long before this. And again, the Reformed authorities strongly disapproved of them, but they were very good craftsmen and contributed enormously to the Dutch economy, including paying taxes. Well, if we're going to tolerate the Church of Antichrist, I suppose we can put up with Anabaptists too. And so the persecuting instincts of Orthodox Dutch Calvinists found themselves constantly held in check by the pragmatists. And so the Dutch Republic blundered into religious toleration and became rich and powerful in consequence.
Why should religious toleration make a country rich and powerful, though? How is that connected to
Well,
this?
because particularly in the minds and hearts of devout people of whatever stripe, whatever religious faith, religion is the most important thing in their lives. And so if they've got freedom in that, they're going to find it very easy to express freedom and to be creative in their energies in other areas of life, like trade and industry. Religiously tolerant societies have prospered. The same thing happened in Britain, not immediately, but in the late 17th century onwards, when, after expending all kinds of efforts in tolerating dissent, the British state pretty much finally gave up after 1688, 1689. And the same thing happened in the American colonies, right, where the original Puritan settlers wanted to establish
Right.
the exclusive privileges of the Congregational Church in New England. And at first, they jailed Baptists and hanged Quakers. Right? But in the end, their determination to do it failed them as well. At first, if you ask them, well, are you really prepared to go out 30, 40, 50 miles through a howling blizzard in New England in order to round up the Baptists and Quakers and haul them back to the jail in Boston? The answer was yes. But in the end, it was no. America was just too big, right? The people coming were too diverse,
Right.
right? As Winnie the Pooh would have said, it just wouldn't. But New England, like Old England, benefited enormously from the kind of energies, economic and commercial energies that went with that. I mean, it makes me laugh, because ever since the Dutch and the British and the Americans have been patting themselves on the back, we did the right moral good thing, we were tolerant, and the Lord blessed us in consequence. In each case, they tried persecution really hard until it just wouldn't. And they reaped the bananas in consequence. Well, the Dutch were the trailblazers here. Accidental byproduct of the Reformation.
Is that concept still true today, like that religiously tolerant countries tend to be more affluent?
Probably yes. I'm not. I really need to think about that one, because religion is no longer the dominant meta narrative of our collective lives,
Right.
surely, and in many ways not even of our individual lives. Though of course it is for many people. But I still suspect it is true, and also that a rigidly enforced orthodoxy of any kind, whether that's religious, for example, in Saudi Arabia, or political, as in communist countries, is more or less a guarantee for commercial failure. Yeah. Well, the Reformation also spawned something that would previously have been unthinkable, and that is a religiously inspired, mostly Calvinist theory rebellion. Now, this is one of the things that contributed mightily to the awful wars of religion, which so disfigured European society from, let us say, the middle of the 16th century until the middle of the 17th. So now this passage is taken from Philippe du Plessis-Mornay, who was an important figure in the French Huguenots. The Huguenots are the French Calvinists. Now, I think we might have mentioned this in the previous episode. In the long run, France, of course, did not become Protestant. The Huguenots, the Reformed, managed to win over for quite a long while. Well, almost none of the peasants, for reasons we talked about in the previous episode. Peasants just are not going to go for this stuff. Maybe half of the nobility and about 90% of the lawyers. Well, those people can at least well outpunch their weight, right, in all sorts of respects. So Philippe du Plessis-Mornay is arguing that where a monarch is a tyrant, then the godly have the duty, not simply the right, but the duty to overthrow him. There's all sorts of interesting missteps made here, which will be immediately obvious to us, I think. It is then not only lawful for Israel to resist a king who overturns the law and the church of God. Now, already, wait a minute, Israel, Old Testament Israel, the church of God? Right. But in the minds of many Reformed, still today, I have heard this from some Reformed spokesmen, they will want to insist that really there's only one covenant. But in the minds of many, particularly then, the continuities between the two covenants, Old Testament and New, loom far larger than the mere detail of how we are saved through Christ. So they often spoke about Old Testament Israel as the Church of God and made a parallel between then and now. So it's not only lawful for Israel to resist a king who overturns the law and the Church of God, but if they do not do so, they're guilty of the same crime and are subject to the same penalty. When we speak of the people collectively, we mean those who receive authority from the people. In every properly constituted kingdom, this is the character of the officers of the crown, the peers, the lords, the patricians, the notables, and others chosen by the several estates who, in various combinations, make up the membership of the council. Now, he is by implication, not explicitly, downplaying the role of the king. He will make this explicit in a moment. The office of all these is to see that no harm is suffered either by the Commonwealth, the secular society, or by the church. That's the duty of the secular governors. For although these offices are severally below the king, they are collectively above him. Now that itself is an innovation. Right? It implies the significant erosion of the feudal order. We have shown that the people as a whole, or the officers of the kingdom whom the people have established, or the majority of these, or any one of them, gravely sin against the covenant with God if they do not use force against a king who corrupts God's law or prevents its restoration. Now, the covenant with God, the Reformed were convinced that the covenant is made between God and the population of this particular country. Right? Because, of course, they espouse a compulsory state religion, just as the Catholics do. So they see that as being a covenant with God, just like God with Old Testament Israel. So again, this illustrates the kind of minimum difference they see between the Old Testament and the New. Residents of towns and provinces, which are the individual parts of a kingdom, are subject to the same penalty if they do not at least drive idolatry beyond their borders. Idolatry? Well, they're not talking about paganism here. Nobody was practicing paganism. They're talking about Catholicism. So what he's really saying is that Protestants have a duty to rise up against Catholic rulers. When the ruler seeks to introduce it, idolatry as they would have seen it, and maintain true doctrine by whatever means they can, even if it means seceding temporarily at some point. So it's a manifesto for reformed rebellion against Catholic rulers, which goes a long way to bring about or to justify the wars of religion that were beginning even then. I mean, the Dutch wars we've already noticed. Now, France was plagued by, I counted them once, the number of civil wars in France in the late 16th century, but they kind of run into one another. I'm going to say 9, but if somebody knows more, I'm sure they'll mention it in the comments. That's just coming off the top of my head. Loads and loads of wars of religion in the late 16th century. The most notorious single event of which was this, the Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572, which is illustrated here. And here we have another illustration, a contemporary drawing. Note the horrid manner of the killings. This is part of Protestant propaganda, trying to illustrate the massacre of Protestants by Catholics as luridly as possible. So this event is part of the Black Legend.
And the Black Legend being the Catholic oppression of Protestantism.
Yes, but not just generally, but it kind of it strings together a number of events or phenomena. So, for example, the Inquisition, Mary's killing of Protestants during her reign in England, the Spanish Fury in Antwerp, the Bartholomew's Day Massacre, and so on. Right? The story that Protestants tell about the Catholic Church by the late 16th century is the opposite of the story they had said when the Reformation began, that the Catholic Church is decadent and not religiously serious. Now that the story is that the Catholic Church is ferocious and persecuting and so on. Yeah. Well, it certainly was a terrible event and involved the deaths of thousands of people. This next illustration is a 19th century painting. I think, if I remember correctly, made in England, but I might be wrong about that. It's a famous painting. Doubtless someone will correct me if I'm wrong on YouTube. Indeed, from what we've seen so far, somebody will correct me even if I'm right. Sorry, that was a bit naughty, but there we are. So Catherine de' Medici was basically the regent for her sons. Her husband had died in a jousting accident in 1559. Silly man, he should never have. Leaving her with a brood of sickly sons who had a habit of dying quite young themselves, or very young themselves. And so she was the regent for several of them in turn. And she had basically authorized this massacre. Now we've got a couple of descriptions here. One from a Spanish ambassador's secretary, who should have been sympathetic to what had been done, but he sounds pretty revolted, or at least he manages to be dispassionate anyway. On Sunday, St. Bartholomew's Day, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the alarm was rung. All the Parisians began killing the Huguenots of the town, breaking down the doors of the houses in which they lived and pillaging what they found within. The said Guise, Aumale, and Angoulême, these are the leading Catholic noble families, went to the Admiral's house, the Admiral being Coligny, I think, yes, one of the leading Protestant notables, which they entered. They went up to his room, and in the bed in which he was lying, the Duke of Guise shot him in the head with a pistol. Then they took him and threw him naked out of the window into the courtyard of his house. The massacre lasted until the morning of Tuesday, 25th August. On this day, the most Christian king, this is the official title of the King of France, so the boy, dressed in his royal robes, went to the palace and declared to the parliament that he'd been obliged to make the peace that he had made with the Huguenots because his people were exhausted and ruined. But now that God had given him victory over his enemies, he decided that the edict that he formerly published should be observed, according to which no other religion than the Catholic, Apostolic and Roman might be practiced in the kingdom. The princes of Béarn, Navarre and Condé are utterly downcast. They were surviving Protestant notables. They dare not say a word. And an official said that on the 27th, they went to Mass with the king, despite their Protestant convictions.
Wow.
Well, another report we have is from a Protestant who survived. He was only 13 at the time, and he wrote this account in 1634 when he would have been, well, let's do the math here, that's going to be, 62 years later, he'd been 75. I made up my mind to try to reach the Collège de Bourgogne, where I was a student, although it was far from my lodgings. The distance made it dangerous. I put on my student's gown and, taking a large breviary under my arm, a Catholic prayer book, went downstairs. As I walked out into the street, I was horrified. There were madmen running to and fro, smashing down doors and shouting, "Kill, kill, massacre the Huguenot." Blood spattered before my eyes and doubled my fear. I ran into a clump of soldiers who stopped me. They plied me with questions and began to jostle me about, when luckily they saw my breviary. That served as my safe conduct. Twice again the same thing happened, and twice again I escaped. At last I reached the Collège de Bourgogne, but there a greater danger awaited me. The porter refused to let me in, and I remained out in the street at the mercy of the madmen, who kept increasing in numbers. I bethought myself of asking for the principal of the college, a good man, who was very friendly to me, and by the aid of a little money, bribery, I got in. The principal took me to his room, where two inhuman priests talked of Sicilian vespers and tried to get me out of his hands, saying that the order was to kill everyone, down to the babies at the breast. The principal locked me up in an out-of-the-way closet, where I stayed for 3 days. So that's Maximilien de Bethune. Pretty terrible event.
Yeah, the kind of stuff that probably stays with you for a while, I suppose.
Yes. Well, I found when I was putting this together that I had some even more horrifying accounts than the ones I've got here, I'm afraid, and I decided I would just spare us all. But yeah. And of course, although this aroused passions all around at the time, what happened after all these wars were over is that this played into the hands of, still today, plays into the hands of secularists who want to say, well, religion causes all of these wars. We're better off without it.
Right.
And of course, the last and the worst of these was the so-called 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. And again, I'm going to be giving a simplification so gigantic that it's almost like a cartoon version, but let's try it. Here we have a map of the divisions of Germany in 1610.
Now, Germany at this point is just a geographical expression, like Scandinavia, right? I mean, it's all part of the Holy Roman Empire that we discussed last time.
That's right. Yes, it is. Yeah. And the Holy Roman Empire now consists of a whole lot of states which are increasingly going their own way, including in religious policy. But they're afraid of one another precisely because of that. And there have been leagues and alliances, rather like NATO and Warsaw Pact in the Cold War, as guarantors of defence of one another should it ever come to war. But in 1618, for reasons we can't go into now, it did. Now, as you can see from the map, the areas in orange are under Catholic rulers, those in blue under Lutheran rulers, and those in grey under Reformed rulers. And the areas that we now call the Czech Republic, but also Silesia, are much more mixed. So ostensibly Catholic, but with large numbers of Lutherans in Silesia, and Lutherans and Reformed, and also Hussites, let us call them another form of proto-Protestant for simplicity now, in the Czech lands. Well, the result was a complete bloodbath that went on for 30 years. The most notorious incident of that was the most notorious single incident was the siege of Magdeburg in late 1630 and early 1631, with an illustration here and another here. At the end of it, the besieging Catholic armies broke into this Protestant city and massacred 2/3 of the citizens, the people living in the city. Well, we have an account of this from a Swedish official The whole city, he said, was plundered until it was bare. Finally, everything was set alight, totally burnt down. Only the cathedral and 4 or 5 adjoining houses and a few fishermen's cottages along the River Elbe survived. About 300 citizens were on the side of the emperor, and when the enemy first broke into the city, they ran to greet them, but were the first to be slaughtered. I mean, this is the kind of thing that's very common with soldiers breaking in during a siege. Their blood is up, and they're just going to kill and do terrible things to whoever they see. A large section of the citizenry fled into the cathedral, but those who hoped to save themselves by fleeing to the other churches were all massacred. The clergy were most terribly treated. They were first massacred in their library and then burnt along with their books. Their wives and daughters were tied behind the horses, dragged into camp, raped, and terribly molested. The Church of St. John was full of womenfolk whom they locked in from the outside and throwing burning torches through the windows. The Croats and Walloons in the Emperor's army, Walloons, by the way, are, well, we'd say today, in modern terminology, Francophone people in what's now Belgium. They behaved mercilessly, throwing children into the fire, tying the more beautiful and well-off women citizens to their stirrups, made off with them behind their horses out of town. They spiked small children onto their lances, waved them around and cast them into the flames. So it's grotesque atrocity. In the later stages of the war, Catholic France came in on the side of the Protestant German states, which seems very strange to us. This is supposedly a religious war, but it was largely about state power. France was busily giving a very hard time to its own now much diminished Protestant minority, but it fought on behalf of the Protestant German states. Why? Because the King of France wanted a religiously divided Holy Roman Empire. He didn't want an all-powerful emperor governing from Vienna. And in the end,
Right.
both sides were so exhausted that they made peace at Westphalia. This is actually a very famous treaty or series of treaties. What the peace treaties reveal is that the state is now stronger than the church, even in Catholic states. That's the irony of all this.
Because Catholic rulers now have a choice about remaining Catholic, so they're basically in the driving seat instead of the Pope.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. If the emperor wants to make peace with the Protestants and the Pope's unhappy about it, there's nothing the Pope can do about it. Henceforth, if Catholic rulers want to deal with Protestants, make peace with Protestants, even alliances with them, the Pope can do nothing. If they want to make domestic arrangements that the Pope doesn't like, the same. If they get fed up with the Jesuits, as a number of them did, and drive the Jesuits out of the country, the Pope can protest. He can do nothing because the Catholic rulers now have a choice. So from now on, Protestant Catholic churches would be used quite consciously by rulers simply as a means of social control, keeping their populations in order, which was going to become more difficult because feudalism was falling apart in most places, or had already gone in places like England long before. Since the Pope was now the Catholic ruler's client, rather than vice versa, as in the Middle Ages, the doctrine of the divine right of kings would become paramount. We're now entering into the age of absolutism, the idea that kings should rule absolutely, and that was the will of God. So it's a kind of a deal, certainly in the case of Catholic kingdoms, between the papacy and the Catholic rulers. The Catholic rulers agree to enforce Catholicism on their subjects, and in return, the Church will preach up the divine right of kings, against which it is mortal sin to rebel. Means of social control.
So the church and the rulers are sort of helping each other out with this.
Yes, and this is the kind of thing which rolling the time on forward to the 19th century, Karl Marx would point out and say, well, that's all religion is. It's kind of like a trick played on the population by the rulers, which was historically very far from the truth. But there was something to be said for that argument in the world after 1648. Yeah. So what the war had shown was that the Reformation could neither be completed, because Western Christendom as a whole would not become Protestant, maybe just a third of it, nor could it be extinguished by war, as the 30 Years' War had just demonstrated. Right? They'd fought one another to a standstill. And in consequence, international politics became secularized. Rulers made treaties with one another on the basis of territorial and political interest, not necessarily on the basis of common shared religious confession. But also, internal politics slowly became secularized because religious minorities had accidentally been engendered in many states. Many Catholic states had Protestant minorities that they couldn't completely eradicate. And Protestant states had Catholic minorities. Right? Domestic politics would, in the long run, not the short, but the long run, become secularized, especially in several key Protestant states. Now, we've already noticed the very obvious examples of the Dutch Republic and of England and of the English colonies in America, right? But to a smaller extent, the same was true of a number of other states. So that has the effect of secularizing politics.
But at this point, that everybody's sort of been through, all of these
They've been to hell.
wars and revolts and things. Yeah, they've been through a lot. Now, is this more apparent to the average peasant that we mentioned before, that there's a broader political or religious agenda that's going on, or they're still mostly oblivious?
I think they're still mostly oblivious. The peasants, before as after, will be far more aware of local realities and the things that affect them immediately. They are certainly not about to be taken up by, in the 18th century, the arrival of modernist ideologies and stuff like that. That this has zero effect on them. And when they do encounter it, they consider them either offensive or ridiculous, as a lot of 19th, but certainly early and mid-19th century politics will illustrate. Yeah, no, it doesn't. Which is far from saying that they're not extremely distressed by the tortures that they've just been through, of course.
Sure.
So the consequences of this religious impasse, since secular government was now, in both Protestant and Catholic states, more powerful than the church, and religiously motivated domestic and foreign policies had led merely to massacre and chronic instability, politics became secularized, not on principle, but in practice. The principle, as so often, comes afterwards. The practice comes first, the principle to justify it later on, which is exactly what the Anabaptists, had they deigned to care about such things at all, might have wished. I mean, they didn't care about such things at all, right? But if they had bothered about it, they would have wanted a more secular state as well. And Protestantism's rationalizing tendencies, the kind of thing that we talked about last week, the elevation of an abstract truth above tradition and personal authority, ended up 100 years later in the 18th century breaking loose from their religious moorings and began to challenge religion itself. Now, all of this was exactly as Luther's opponents had predicted way back in the early 16th century. Tradition was overturned in favour of 18th century ideas about progress. Obligation overturned in favour of rights. Our ancestors, schoolboys now began to learn, were all fools. So what we can see is that, now of course this is not an immediate product of the Reformation, I want to stress that, but it is a product of it in the long term over 200 years and more.
So we're saying that the Reformation eventually leads to the Enlightenment?
Yes, we are. Again, I don't want to overstate that because although the Enlightenment is a very important force in Britain and America, it's also an important force in France, which is Catholic. Although in Britain and America, most Enlightenment thinkers are not necessarily anti-religious, whereas in France they tend to be, because Catholicism has this more exclusive hold on society. You can't really be in favour of Enlightenment thought in France without being opposed to the Catholic Church. But nevertheless, yes, you can say the Reformation does lead more or less to the Enlightenment in the long run.
Although this was ultimately unintended by the Reformation in the beginning, right? Like this wasn't they didn't set out to change things
Most
this
things that
way.
happen in history happen unintentionally. The law of unintended consequences. Yes, yes. People set out to do one thing without stopping to think that it will have this side effect, that side effect, and so on further up the road. Yeah, that I'm afraid is how things work. Yeah. Well, maybe at the end we should just go back to a map we looked at last week, which is showing the religious pattern of Europe. I want to put the word today in thick quotation marks here because, of course, Europe today is overwhelmingly secular. But at least looking at the religious cultures that have shaped different areas of Europe in the long run. So the areas in blue, Catholic, majority Catholic or overwhelming majority Catholic. The areas in lilac, one species or other of Protestantism. The areas in pink, Eastern Orthodoxy, and those areas were hardly at all affected by the Reformation, and in consequence were only belatedly affected by the Enlightenment. And the areas in yellow, majority Muslim.
Well, I'm already feeling a little bit less pro Reformation than probably some of our church leaders would like me to feel.
Yes. Does this mean that we should all go back and become Catholic? Well, of course, our Catholic viewers want to say, yes, yes, you see, we were right all along. This is not quite what we're saying. We're not actually making any recommendations here in particular. I mean, my personal preference, as you know, would be to pull for Team Anabaptism. What we're simply trying to do is to account for what has happened, which is really, I think, the main honest task that a historian can do. And a lot of
Right.
people who dabble in history are, in my not entirely humble opinion, engaged in dishonest tasks. Well, next week, to conclude this series, we're going to be looking at the effects of the Reformation upon the economy and upon commerce, because that too has decisively shaped the world that we live in right now, and not just in areas that became Protestant, not just among people who became Protestant. So that's for next week. Thank you for staying with us, everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you again then.